Today is the last, and you could turn my volume down, please. Thank you. See, that's how loud I had to be when y'all weren't paying attention but were being too friendly. Today is the last of our series in the Raw. And one of the reasons why I spoke this series is because I grew up in church all my life. And sometimes I think that my experience has been that people think they have to not be human when they come to church. People think that they can't be real. People think they can't display the pain that they feel because they might be criticized or judged. The more I move into this master's program that I'm in, the more I realize that it's been easy to fall into a stereotypical way of accepting mental health issues. And I just want to emphasize to you guys that mental health issues and physical health issues, they're interwoven. If you're battling through anxieties and depression, especially, if I could just focus on that, because that seems to be a place where so many people lie, I want you to know it's okay. You can be a Christian and struggle with depression. I believe Abraham did. You can be a Christian and struggle with anxiety. I believe that we can find evidences of Scripture where people did that. I think to sit here and to say, well, you don't have enough faith, I think there's something wrong with that statement. And I really want you to see it this morning, especially, for example, as you read the Psalms, that David had highs and lows. He had times when he was very depressed. And at times, perhaps, you see anxieties and frustrations coming out of David's life. But here's what I love about the story of David. It's the purpose of why I believe this series was important for me to teach. David, even in the midst of the struggle, kept his eyes focused on God. He didn't sit here and say, God, you've abandoned me. He asked God some good, hard questions, and he did it in the raw. Which means he didn't sit here and write 27 different ways of asking God or telling God how he felt. He just said, God, right now life stinks. Right now, God, I'm a little upset. I'm a little upset at you at times, God, because you should be doing more than you're doing and you're not doing it, and so it's not fair. This is David. But at the end of the chapters, when he poured his life out like that, David would come back to, but I know that you're God. I'm not. Thanks for listening. David treated God like God had big shoulders. And I want you to understand that God can bear up you in the raw. He can handle it. He's not up in heaven ever going, did you hear what Debbie said? He's up in heaven going, I love you. I accept you. But I'm not content to leave you where you're at. So let's work together. Am I making sense this morning? So, this morning I'm going to be using a word interchangeably. Our title this morning is Resigned. But I'm going to be using, and you'll see this as you break out your study sheet, please do, in your bulletin. I'm going to be using the word or interchanging the word surrender with resigned. Okay? Or resignation. Know that the title is good. I simply want to bring out one difference between resignation and surrender, and I'll bring it out at the end of this message. How many of you all have ever felt like this? I surrender. I give up. I can't do it. How many of you, don't raise your hand, but how many of you are feeling that way right now? How many of you feel like right now you are doing everything possible that you can to get by, but the reality is that it's just kind of like you just barely got your nose above the water. You're flapping and slapping, trying to keep your head up. You feel like you have to concede. You feel like you have to give up. You feel like you have to stop fighting. But in your flesh, there's a pushback against that. It's kind of like you're saying, if I give up, I'm powerless. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. In your flesh, if you give up, you feel like you're not enough. But I want to ask you this morning, what if the resignation or the surrender was a part of God's way of saying to you, it's time. It's time to quit fighting. It's time to let me handle this. What if God were saying to you this morning that if you'll give up, if you'll resign, if you'll surrender, Romans 8:28 will come out of this for you. You just have to take your hands off what I, God, am responsible for. If God has said this to you, keeping in the fight is a dangerous place for you as a Christian to be. We've talked these last 3 weeks about the devil being a liar. Can I tell you some of the things that I am sure the devil would be saying to you if you are right now battling to surrender? It'd be stuff like this. You can't trust God. Or, God has no plan for you. Or, anything you get in your life is going to be a result of your own hard work and your own efforts. So, you have to keep fighting. Because if you quit, all that you're going to get is more pain. Can anybody identify with what I'm talking about? Yeah? Yeah. But here's the problem. The problem is when God has told you to lay down the fight, to keep fighting, that is like saying to God, God, you are not enough. And does any of us really believe that? I mean, when you look back at your story and see where you have been and where God has taken you to, even if right now you feel like, I just got to keep my head above the water, would you say to God, you are not enough? I've mentioned this verse now through all 4 of these messages because I want to remind you, you have a history with God. We have a history where Satan has attempted time and again to batter this truth down. We have a history where you have hung on to this truth desperately as if life itself has depended on it. We have a history where God has proved this truth to you. But Satan is going to attack it through every crisis that we face. He's going to convince you or attempt to convince you that even though it might have been that way in the past, it's not going to be that way this time. God is going to fail you. He's going to try to get you to look past the benefit, one of the benefits by which you are saved. Yes, it's about going to heaven. But one of the benefits by which you are saved that we receive because of salvation is God in us working all things out for the good. Satan will try to have you get rid of that, light it on fire, so that it all goes up in smoke, sacrifice to the idea that I cannot trust God's intentions for me. He will not deliver. Let me ask you something. How can you ever surrender to God if you don't trust that His plan is good? We can't. And so we have to. And so this morning I'm talking about resignation or surrender. Let me share with you the text this morning that I'm going to pull from here. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and it says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, this is a reference to John, he said to her, woman, Mom, my mother would never let me call her woman. My wife takes after that. He says, woman, here is your son. And to the disciple, John, here is your mother. And from that time, the disciples took her into his home. What are we seeing? We're seeing that in order for Jesus to accomplish the plan that God had for him, one of the most dear relationships in his life had to be surrendered, had to be resigned. It's interesting because we hear the word surrender, especially as Americans, and we want to fight, don't we? Let's try something else. Pulled a couple quotes down. Some of these you may be familiar with. One is an homage to the cheeseheads in the room. All right. Vince Lombardi said, the harder you work, the harder it is to surrender. John Kennedy said, the cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it, and one path we will never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Jesse Jackson said, if you fall behind, run faster. Never give up, never surrender, and rise up against the odds. Do you see how this is in our culture and it's being taught to us? And I'm not necessarily saying I disagree with these things as an American. I'm proposing to you that this notion of surrender or don't surrender is just so deep in our culture that we're taught to quit the fight, to resign, is actually anti-American. But I want you to look at this for just a minute. Now, this guy, I found his quote. Please don't ever read anything that he says, because he's basically a spiritual, how do I want to describe it? The Bible is not an important thing to him. But every once in a while, the clock hits the right time, right? And so he actually said something that I think is really good here. His name is Eckhart Tolle. He's a German guy, spiritualist. He says, to some people, surrender may have a negative connotation, implying defeat, giving up, failing to rise to the challenges of life, becoming lethargic, and so on. True surrender, however, is something entirely different. It does not mean to passively put up with whatever situation you find yourself in and to do nothing about it, nor does it mean to cease making plans or initiating positive action. This is what's good about what he said. Surrender is the simple and profound wisdom of yielding to rather than opposing the flow of life. How does that factor into our lives? This guy's not a Christian, but he gets the idea of surrender maybe better than most. He mentions this flow of life. And I want to quantify that this morning, which means I want to put the laser pointer on this to really flesh out what the flow of life it is for a person of faith. I would call the flow of life the plan of God. And the wisdom of this statement by Tolle basically allows us to surrender or resign to a God who has a good plan, a plan that is beyond us, a plan that He is working to our benefit day by day. So if we take the idea that Tolle is proposing here and interchange flow of life with God's plan for us, this is a very Christian statement. We have to trust and then ultimately concede to God's plan for our lives. And the Bible tells us why. Psalm 33:11. It says, the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purpose of His heart through all generations. A passage that many of us familiar with is Jeremiah 29:11, where it says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Solomon would write in the Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not to your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him and He will direct your path. Jesus himself taught, if you want to save your life, you'll destroy it. But if you give up your life for me, you'll actually find it. See, what we have to grab is, as Christians, we're not Christians because we've accepted an academic knowledge that there was a guy named Jesus and he was executed by the Romans. We are Christians because we have believed in Jesus' message, in Jesus' life, and are now patterning our lives against his. What did Jesus do? He taught surrender. So let me maybe bring some of these ideas to a close here this way. Surrender is countercultural. It is not American to surrender. Second thing, even the unsaved, in Tully's case, they understand that there's a time for laying down the fight. Solomon said there's a time and a season for everything, right? Well, even the unsaved understand you can't fight on every hill. There's a time for not fighting. But thirdly, only surrender to Christ will give you, or only in surrender to Christ will give you peace and fulfillment. And I want you to consider what surrender looks like. And again, go back to the small text that I gave you today. In Jesus' context, he knew his purpose. I have not come to take care of my mother until she dies. I have come to die for humanity. But that didn't stop the fact that Jesus loved his mother. And again, I always push back on this because I think it's important. Jesus did not walk around with a halo. Jesus did not walk around with the sun coming through the clouds and the angel choir singing behind him. Jesus came to this earth and was fully man. And there's a lot of things that we men can gripe about, but don't talk about our mamas. We want to be in that situation, right? Where we take care of mama. That's the way it works. And so Jesus would have loved his mother and would have wanted the opportunity and would have taken the opportunity he was afforded to take care of his mother. But Jesus, in order to do what he was called to do, had to surrender his mother to John. He had to go, I can't be who mom needs me to be. But by doing so, he submitted to God's plan. And by submitting to God's plan, God's purpose was fulfilled. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, he's Jesus. He can do anything. I'm not Jesus. I can't do that. I love my mama. Let me maybe crawl inside Jesus' head for a moment. And let's maybe examine what some of the raw emotion he might have been feeling might have been like this last week prior to Easter. Today is Palm Sunday. We know that that was the day that there was a great big parade for Jesus and everyone shouted, Hosanna to the highest. And Jesus, if he did not know the future, would have been like, this is the greatest thing ever, right? But can you imagine the one who knew the future might look at this and go, God, they cheer for me now, but where are they going to be in a week? Maybe he would have gone through the raw emotion of, God, I've been with these Jews for 3 years. There's no change in any of them. Did you see what they were doing in the temple? That happens tomorrow. He cleanses the temple. He might have looked at his disciples after he says, one of you will betray me, and they get into a fight of who's the greatest. I would have taken the frying pan and knocked one of them right upside the head. I mean, seriously. One of you are going to betray me. It's not going to be me. I'm better than him. So you can imagine that Jesus maybe in his mind, in the raw emotions that maybe he was feeling at that particular point, might have said, look at these guys. They don't get it. I can't leave yet. Maybe as he looked over when Pilate was asking the crowd, what should we do with Jesus? Maybe the thought entered Jesus' mind, God, why should I suffer for people who haven't appreciated a darn thing I've said to them yet? Maybe as he went to the cross, he thought, will my ministry even matter? Maybe he thought to himself, who's going to take care of Mom? Who's going to look after her? I mean, again, recognizing Jesus was fully man. Charlie, would you have feelings like that? Steve? Jerry? So don't discount that even though Jesus knew his purpose, that he somehow didn't go through the raw human emotion that we face. The Bible, or not the Bible, the hymn book talks about a hymn that says he could have called 10,000 angels. Why would the hymn writer write this hymn unless he was considering the possibility that Jesus could have backed away from his purpose? And the possibility that Jesus could have lost the battle for his mind. The hymn writer wrote, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and for me. Again, I emphasize that Jesus was fully man. He went through everything that we face, yet without sin. Consider the temptations of Jesus. Consider your temptations. Are you tempted by something that you won't fall to? That's not a temptation. I mean, I don't think there's too many people out there that are tempted by okra, right? Or broccoli, spinach, right? No, because we don't want to fall for those things. We have to eat them to live, but come on now. We get tempted by something fatty or chocolatey or something along that line, right? Maybe Satan's legit thought was that if he could alter the thinking of Jesus, he would alter the trajectory of Jesus. He could change God's plan. And all that would be necessary for him to change God's plan was for him to go, I can't stop now. I have to keep on fighting. If that had occurred, Jesus' ministry would have been rendered ineffective. And Jesus might have been able to do that, feeling justified for a multitude of reasons. But for Jesus not to go through what he went through, it would have robbed Jesus of his glory. And it would have robbed each of us of the promise of his death and resurrection and what it secures. So he came to the conclusion, I surrender all. And for the sake of God's purpose being accomplished in my life, and we go back to what the hymn writer said, he died alone for you and for me. And in doing so, he went to the cross. And he trusted the plan of God who gave Jesus purpose. And that purpose is still being fleshed out in the lives of sinners who find eternal life. But also in doing so, he surrendered to God's greater plan for each person who mattered to him. God had a plan for them too. And I want to make sure you're getting this. It isn't just about Jesus surrendering to God's plan for him. But Jesus had to surrender. And I'll pick on some of you in the room just for sake of argument. Jesus had to surrender that God had a plan for Dylan. And Jesus wasn't going to be there to see that fleshed out. God had a plan for Lori. And Jesus wasn't going to be there to be a part of it. And so it's like he had to take his hands off and go, God, I trust you that you are going to flesh out the plan, even if I can't be a part, because I know that your plan is good. He had to trust God. He had to trust God, and that God's plan for the other person was just as good as God's plan for him. And man, this is where we all struggle, isn't it? I remember Bill Bright. He wrote a pamphlet called The Four Spiritual Laws. Did you ever hear that before? Yeah. So number one spiritual law was this: God has a wonderful plan for your life. God loves the sinner, he loves the saint, but he can't work unless people get out of the way and trust the process and surrender to him. And that's tough. It was tough in my own life. 2015, I went to see a counselor because I was in really bad health. And part of going to see that counselor led him ultimately to violate HIPAA and hang me out to dry in front of my colleagues. It was something I could have sued him for. It was completely and totally wrong ethically and professionally, and it was exactly what I needed. Because what ultimately happened is that for the season that I was sick, I was fighting every day. Somebody was coming along and calling me names or trying to step on my reputation, and I just wanted to fight. I wanted to fight to live. I wanted to fight to get my reputation back. I wanted to fight to see things validated and to be justified again. I wanted to fight to show everybody else that I'm still a fighter. And when this man went and did what he did, it took away everything. I literally sat in a chair and went, I lost. And it was what was necessary for me to lay down the fight of self-preservation. And I had to resign myself to it. And here's the thing that I thought was really interesting, what God showed me. There's just the slightest difference between resignation and surrender. You see, when I surrender, I give my plan over to another human being who dictates things for me. But when I resign, I am actually saying what's coming ahead is better than what was behind. I mean, think about when you've left a job. You resign your job, right? You resign your job and you say, okay, this season of my life is over. Now I'm going to step into the new plan for my life. And that's what nailed me at that particular point. That here I wasn't surrendering, I wasn't losing, I was actually winning. Because by saying, God, I'm done fighting, He actually showed me that what was coming was better than what had been. So I'll say it, that's the beauty of surrender. I'll just do it this way. God's plan is always for the good. If we surrender to that truth and resign what was. Are you following me? We surrender to the idea God's plan is for the good. We resign what was. We're saying, God, I'm trusting you that what is coming is only going to be best.